Your thoughts, Gary, on how do we actually, like, how much work should we be doing in terms of sets, just as a generic? Now, obviously, again, this is going to need to be modified for the individual, but are we just using this generic, 10 to 20 sets per week seems to be a good place to be at? Maybe we might modify that as well by saying that start on the lower end, maximize that, and then see what you need to titrate up. And obviously, we'll get onto a further discussion of like allocating volume for what you actually want. Like, there's no point being like, oh, all my muscles need 20 sets when your upper body is fucking, jacked out of your mind and you have literally fucking no calves whatsoever. Calling myself out here. You know what I mean? It's like, maybe you want to allocate volume accordingly. We'll get onto that discussion. But are we just starting at this generic 10 to 20 sets, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, 10 to 20, I would generally agree with. And to be honest, no, I with the caveat that I don't really coach bodybuilders or people who are just super into hypertrophy on its own. Most of my clients are in the 10 to 15 range, to be honest. As I think back to my programs, especially because a lot of my clients are training 3 to 4 days per week. They're not training 5 to 6 days per week. I have a few who are people who are focused more so on just muscle building, but especially when it comes to just the weight training side of things, we're generally doing 3 to 4 sessions per week. So if a person's hitting a muscle group twice per week and we're doing like a full upper lower type split, let's say, they might get 4 sets for chest in their first session, maybe 3 in the second, and then maybe they get 6 in the third with the upper. They're hitting it 3 times per week, but still we're talking just about like 13 sets per week. So it's not crazy, but that's what I tend to prescribe for the vast majority of people. People make great progress in 10 to 15 sets, sometimes even less, especially when it comes to strength. I don't see strength as requiring that much volume, especially early on for people. I think longer term, there might be something to be said for lower effort and more sets for strength. But I mean, that's a different discussion. But most of my clients, 10 to 20 sets per week. I can't think of the last time I've had someone doing more than 20 sets per week for a given muscle group. I think I do have maybe 1 or 2 people, but it's one muscle group and it's kind of 20 to 25. And that's typically how I would basically implement that higher volume strategy. I'm very rarely having someone do 25 to 30 sets across the board, all muscle groups, but it might be that they have a weak chest. They're trying to bring that up. So we hammer that a bit more. And that was the example that I had recently with a client where I think he's doing around 24 to 26 sets for chest per week. But then for his back, he might just be doing 12 to 16 or something, So we're generally kind of taking something from somewhere, putting that muscle group a bit more on maintenance, and then driving on with something else in the meantime, because you just don't have infinite recovery capacity and you will find yourself running into issues, especially it depends how you categorize your volume. But if you're doing 25 sets for chest and 25 sets for shoulders and 25 sets for back, there's often a lot of crossover there using the same joints, similar muscles, and that can just catch up on you quite quickly.
Yeah, 100%. And again, that goes to more of the discussion of like allocating the volume to where you actually want it or need it. Like the lowest I've generally seen, again, I coach mainly people that are looking to, transform their physique, and then also not just, purely focus on physique. Like they want to move better, they want to perform better, they want to, generally be better humans overall. It's not just like, oh, I want to look a certain way, which, we might change or modify our recommendations as a result. But generally speaking, like 6 sets per week, that's kind of what I've seen as the lowest effective dose. Now, that also doesn't include like crossover stuff, where it's like, oh, like maybe you're doing like upper chest work, like that's clearly working your anterior delt more, so maybe we could just do less anterior delt work, like, so there is obviously crossover, etc. But generally, unless we're just purely keeping something on bare bones maintenance, like you could probably just maintain with like maybe like 2 to 3 hard sets per week. It's like very little is actually needed to maintain. But if we're talking about like what's the minimal effective dose to see some sort of progress, I've kind of seen that in my own training itself, and then also the training of the fucking hundreds of clients that I've coached. It's kind of at that 6 set limit. Now, again, that's just the way I train them, etc. But we could use that maybe as a bottom range, right? But like you said, like I rarely have people up above that kind of 20 sets per week. And if I do, generally speaking, it is, oh, we're working on this one muscle group or this, grouping of muscles. Like maybe it's the lower body. We're like, oh, we just want to bring up the lower body. So we're doing that, with a higher amount of work. And generally the way I'll do this is like, say, for example, we have like 4 days per week training. We want to bias the lower body. We might do like quads and chest one day, and then like hamstrings or glutes or whatever you want to categorize a posterior chain the next day, whip back. So it's like we can basically just have the upper body on the back burner. We're getting 3 to 5 sets maybe on each of those sessions for the upper body, but the bulk of the session is the lower body. So you're basically getting it trained 4 days per week. The only issue with that is obviously you have to be very aware of, like Gary said, the crossover stuff where, okay, you want to work your quads or you want to work your posterior chain, like your lower back is probably going to get hit with both of those. So we need to minimize the amount of work that's being done for that, or we need to account for that at least, So in my mind, there are some relatively clear guidelines we can use. 10 to 20 sets per week seems to be a good place to be at. And then with that general framework, we are modifying or allocating volume differently depending on what we actually want to work on. Like again, maybe for you, Gary, you're like, oh, your shoulders respond really well to training. Like you don't need a huge amount of extra work for them, but maybe, I don't know, like for me, for example, like my calves just don't grow. And if I'm like, I want to grow them, I'm going to have to, first of all, prioritize them earlier in the session. And then also probably do more volume for them if I want them to actually, grow. So we can, like, it doesn't have to be everything is at that 10 to 20 sets per week. We can allocate volume, accordingly, right? The only thing I want to finish up on this discussion on saying is, and we probably should have just discussed it a second ago, but is this the kind of discussion of RPE and rating of, or not even rating of perceived exertion, reps in reserve. So rating of perceived exertion, and then also reps in reserve. Like the first question I have for this is, do our exercises need to be to failure? Like, do we need to get to failure to get results? And then as a result of the answer to that question, like where should we be working, roughly speaking, if we're just talking again generalized context, where should we be working in this kind of RPE context and or reps in reserve context? Like we don't need to, like some clients I don't use this stuff with, some clients I'm like, okay, we need to be at this, and it all depends on like where we are in this kind of continuum of progression. Like if you're able to progress week to week, like every single week is, you're seeing increases in strength and whatever else, is like, do we need to be using RPE or reps in reserve like a huge amount? Maybe not. But obviously, if you're like, I haven't increased my fucking bench press in 6 months, it's like, yeah, we probably need to use something like RPE or reps in reserve. But there are my questions, Gary. Do we need to reach failure? And what's the fucking crack with RPE and reps in reserve?
Yeah, I think it's very, very hard to justify the answer that you need to take your sets to failure. Like I don't see reason for that to be the case. I think that when you look at the research, even if you don't feel it to be 100% accurate, which is probably not when we're talking about failure, to be honest, it doesn't seem like going to failure offers much of a benefit versus leaving a couple of reps in the tank. And to be honest, this is one of those areas as well where it's actually hard to say that, oh, I'm not sure if I trust the research on that. I don't believe that they're actually going to failure. And then to come out with the opposite conclusion. Because if you do say here that you don't trust they're going to failure, that even strengthens the argument for being further from failure even more, because it means that not only might they be 5 reps short of failure, they might be 8 reps short of failure. So I think the conclusion from the research is that you definitely don't need to be going to failure for either strength or muscle building. With that said, I think there are absolutely situations in which you should, such as testing days where you're actually testing your strength and you want to be able to use that to inform training going forward. That's not just for people who are competing. It's also for your average everyday gym goer who every now and then should actually test how many reps they can do at a given weight. What is your true 10 rep max? Because that'll allow you to be honest then with your RPE or your reps in reserve ratings, because that's something you do see quite often is someone might be using something like reps in reserve and they'll say, oh yeah, that was 2 RIR. But then if they really push themselves that weight, they might have gotten 6 more. So having those testing days, especially if under the eye of a coach, that can definitely just strengthen your understanding of where your performance is actually at. So I don't think you need to go to failure. I think that if you look at a lot of for example, the Russian strength training in the Soviet era for wrestling, for off-season weightlifting, and people trying to put on muscle, like you look at the training that they were doing, it's very frequently lots and lots of sets, but it's also maximal work. And you see that in lots of sports as well, where in the off season, they're doing lots of sets, but it's submaximal work. They're focusing on their technique. They're keeping the reps nice and quality. And they're not allowing themselves to go all the way to failure. So I think that's my general perspective. You don't need to take things all the way to failure. Strength and conditioning secrets of the world's greatest fighters.
That actually almost looks like it's in Hebrew when it's backwards on my screen. But yeah, this is one of those things as well. It's like, again, this whole discussion comes back to, first of all, what do the reps like? What's the intensity level of those reps? Like, are we talking about failure at 5 reps versus failure at 25 reps? Are we talking about you're doing 20 sets per week? Like, there's so many other variables. And while, yes, we can discuss the rep, like the starting off with the rep and then the actual single set itself, like if you are only doing one single set, you probably do need to be closer to failure. It's just a matter of fact, you're just doing less work overall. So that work needs to, elicit more of an adaptation. Whereas if you're doing 20 sets, inherently you're going to need to be further away from failure, because there's no one out there that's doing 20 sets to failure. And if you think you are doing that, I behoove you to go to an actually competent trainer and go, take me through my workout routine and actually make sure I'm doing it all correct, right? Because first of all, they'll definitely critique your technique, but also they'll be like, man, you are so far away from failure on all of those sets, because if you think you're doing 20 sets at failure, you're just not, right? I'm sure there's people out there that are like, oh, I definitely am. And I've never seen them actually play out. They literally upload videos and then you're like, man, there's literally 20 reps in reserve here. Like, did you actually think that was failure? So that's the first thing. If you were doing less sets, you probably need to be closer to failure. But if you are in that kind of 10 to 20 rep range or 20 set per week range, you don't necessarily need to be closer to failure. Generally, I kind of use that last set of an exercise as a bit of a guide. We should probably, in my mind at least, be above an RPE 8 or a reps in reserve of like 2 for that last set, as fatigue has accumulated across those sets or whatever. Like, we probably want to be getting closer and closer to failure. And especially as we go through a training block overall, like at some stage for that last set, at least, like if you're doing 3 sets of an exercise, we probably want to get closer and closer to near failure, at least. Like you probably want to, at some stage, like say you're doing 3 sets of 8, you probably at some stage want to get 8 reps, 7 reps, like we want to know that we're getting close to failure, or at least somewhat hitting failure, and some people would disagree with that. Some people like to just always consistently keep, 2 reps in the tank. So they might go, oh yeah, I got 8 reps, there's 2 reps left in the tank. I got 8 reps, there's 2 reps left in the tank. And then rather than hitting 7 and being at like, 0 reps left in the tank, they'll be like, no, I stopped at 5, because they're like, all right, so I'm always keeping 2 reps left in the tank. Some people would do that. It's hard to argue which is a better method. They realistically both work. It's not a case of, oh, one is inherently 1,000 times better than the other. It's probably, splitting hairs in terms of what's actually going to result in a better response. And it's probably down to the individual's unique mentality rather than the actual like physiology of it. It's like, do you actually like getting closer to failure? Do you like kind of pushing to that limit, and obviously there is a much further discussion, which we probably will have, in terms of how you actually set up your program. Are we doing one single set, getting closer to failure, maybe doing a back off set then, or are we doing like, these classical like straight sets? Like, how are we actually organizing our training? Because there are other things as well that potentially modify this, such as, you're doing rest pause work, like there's different things that we potentially would modify our recommendations as a result of, right? But for now, to wrap up this podcast, unless you have anything else to say, Gary, we basically want to have that kind of RPE, or rating of perceived exertion. We probably want to be at least a 7 or 8 for our training. I would think that would be fairly well supported by the research itself, but then also anecdotal, like everyday research, people training. We probably want to be somewhere around 7 or 8, maybe a little bit higher at times at least. And then also, if we're talking about like reps in reserve, we probably want to have 2 reps in reserve for the majority of our training. But again, at some stage, get to that kind of 1 or 0 reps in reserve, And again, you can do this through, testing days, where you're like, oh, I'm going to go in and see what my 10 rep max is, my 5 rep max is, or whatever it is. Or you can just use that last set. Like I'm a very big proponent of that last set being like, we want to eventually push that to a stage where it's kind of close to failure or 0 reps in reserve. That doesn't mean that that's your 10 rep max or whatever it is, because clearly you've accumulated volume over a training block, and you've accumulated volume over that, and fatigue as well, over that individual session. So it's not a true 10 rep max or whatever, but it still gives us an idea of where we're at in terms of strength, especially repeatable strength, But anyway, Gary, unless you have anything else to say, wrap us up.
Yep, that's it. So if you'd like to work with us and get more specific guidance on your training, you can work with our expert coaching team. Just get in touch. You can DM us on Instagram at Triage Method, or you can email info@triagemethod.com, and you'll find information related to that below, including client testimonials from previous clients who have worked with us. So get in touch for further information. We do also have a member site. It's called the Coaches Corner, where coaches can come to learn a bit more about the science and application of training, including how to coach different exercises, the nuances of different exercises and exercise selection, anatomy, nutrition theory, etc. Okay, so get involved if you'd like to learn about that. Again, information below. We also have a newsletter which comes out each month. So the October newsletter will be out in about 2 weeks' time. So if you're listening to this, you should subscribe and make sure that you're up to date on all the content we're putting out, and also the resources that we're recommending. We are also all very active on social media. So Triage Method on Instagram. You can also follow all the individual coaches by clicking on the Triage Method page, following, and then you'll see that we're following all of the coaches. So you can check us all out there. Skinny Guys, the real Paddy Farrell, Brian O'Hingisa, and then we've got Nicola, Shane, and Dean there as well. So you can check them all out. Okay. Other than that, guys, you can join our free Facebook group, the Triage Method Community. It's not too active at the moment, but if you want to get in there and ask us any questions, share a client case that you want us to comment on or whatever, we're more than happy to do that. And if you do listen to the podcast and you enjoy the podcast, share it on your story or on another social media platform that you use, or leave a rating and review if your platform allows, or even just recommend it to a friend in person. Okay. And that would be much appreciated. Help share the good word of Triage.
And if you do like any little segment of the podcast, like we do put them up on YouTube and we do segment them out. If you're like, oh, I want to share that small segment with a friend, and rather than having them listen to an hour and a half podcast or whatever it is, you could be like, oh, here's the 3-minute segment where they talked about that, shared with your friend. Because I know a lot of people like that, and they do seem to be getting a little bit more interaction than just the, here's your 90-minute or an hour podcast or whatever. So if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, that's where all those videos are. It helps obviously grow our business and our channel, etc. If you follow along, like those videos, share them, etc. Right? But yeah, I have nothing else to say. So enjoy the rest of your week, life, everything, guys, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks, folks. That's vidania.